Well, thank you all for coming. Those who haven't heard me talk before, I'm absolutely intrigued by the sense of smell. And you might wonder why. It's not the most obvious pick, because the sense of smell has acquired a rather bad reputation throughout the history of science and the history of the humanities. If we look at the reviews, if we consider the history of science as a sort of a review game, well, actually, it doesn't really get many stars, especially during the Enlightenment. It was kind of put down of being, like, of all the senses, the sense of smell is the one which appears to contribute least to the cognitions of the human mind. But it was not only French people, also my fellow Germans, unfortunately, didn't do it much justice. Immanuel Kant said, which sense is the most ungrateful and the most dispensable? The sense of smell. He even said it doesn't pay to cultivate it, for there are more disgusting things than pleasant ones, especially in crowded places. I don't know why you would go for Kant to think about pleasure, but okay. Nonetheless, don't bash the philosophers. The scientists weren't much helpful either. None other than Darwin was the one who said, well, the sense of smell is of extremely slight service to humankind. And unfortunately, this sentiment has been perpetuated throughout centuries until today, where you see experts like Steven Pinker popularizing the idea that smell is vestigial and the olfactory system is sort of shriveled up. Now, with many statements of that kind, it's of course actually false, and it has been proven false over the last couple of decades. So now, with a new empirical basis, with new insights into the empirical base of smell, shouldn't we rethink the sense of smell? So my project led me to consider the sense of smell as a model, to look at the conceptual foundations of neuroscience and also our theories of perception. Why is that? Well, most of our understanding of the brain is based on the visual system. But the visual system is a very peculiar system, actually. If you look at it, you can trace the stimulus in a fairly orderly manner. You can look at its representation spatially throughout the different processing stages. Seems to also work for audition, seems to also work for the somatosensory system. Does it work for smell? Can you spatially represent a smell? How does the brain allocate neural space to what seems to be a non-spatial multidimensional stimulus? So here we have the first thing. But of course the question is, well, what are we mapping? What are odors in the first place? And this comes to the philosophical question, because our understanding of perceptual objects or objects of perception, again, are often based on vision. We think of boundaries, we think of directionality, position. Can we really describe smells like that? Well, there's a bit of a problem. Even our special cases like hallucinations or illusions are based on categories we derive from the visual system. Can we apply that to smell? Well, that is the answer I basically want to ask, and which hopefully, if I ever get it done, will be published next year with Harvard, a book which answers the question fundamentally, if we look at the sense of smell, how should we reconsider the senses? How would our understanding of the brain and the senses look like? And I've been very, very lucky to work in the laboratory of Stuart Feuerstein, and I'm also very happy that two of my lab mates are here, Dongjing and Lu. And it was quite a journey which led me to write this book, but it was not a straightforward journey, and I would like to tell you a bit more about that, because it tells us a little bit about the struggles and the promises of interdisciplinarity. I came to Stuart's lab as a historian and philosopher of science, and I was interested in routine practices. How do experimental routines, the use of technology, and also the social routines in terms of lab meetings, publication procedures, influence scientific decision-making at the bench? Well, over the couple of years, what happened is that my questions shifted, and they became more aligned with what is traditionally considered to be cognitive science, where I became more interested about the actual nature of smell perception. And here I was very, very fortunate to work with Chris Peacock, who helped me to frame the questions, especially in comparison to the other senses, how to think more philosophically about the nature of perception. You might wonder, how did that transition come about, and what does it tell us about interdisciplinarity? Well, it actually resides in the matter itself, because smell, the science of smell, is a contemporary question. Most of what we learned about smell has been achieved over the last couple of decades. Well, a bit more perhaps, but one of the most key events was actually happening here at Columbia, as most of you know, when Linda Buck and Richard Axel discovered the olfactory receptors in 1991. And one should not forget the many other practitioners in the field. There was a large corpus of knowledge already in fragrance chemistry, where people like John Amour, but also Günther Olof, were working on the chemical basis of scent. But also in the neuroscience and biology, people like especially Gordon Shepherd, who has been adamant that smell is not the odd one out. When he worked on it, especially in the 1970s, people thought smell is the odd one out. It's this weird system which doesn't really apply to anything else. He was like, no, we can study smell with the central methods, with the same methods, with the same questions as the other systems in neuroscience. He was proven right. And my research has allowed me to not only investigate in Stuart's lab, but also to collaborate with other laboratories, visit them, and interview the practitioners. But what that showed me is that my training in philosophy of science started to fail me. It started to fail me in the sense that if we look at philosophical concepts, how we describe science, empirical success, evidence, model choice, all these key concepts, well, we build them on historical cases. We look at phlogiston, we look at the chemical revolution, we look at Einstein, we look at things that actually are sort of closed compared to many more dynamic aspects of current science. And I started to wonder, well, should we maybe rethink our central concepts in the philosophy of science and the role of philosophy of science as complementary to the actual ongoing practices? Especially when things are in flux, the nature of evidence, the weighing of evidence changes. And in that context, well, there has been already some looking at how can we use the history complementary to current inquiries? Can we recreate experiments? Can we kind of use historical episodes as heuristics, as sort of a history of ideas to look at contemporary questions? I wanted more. I thought, well, can we do a little bit more in the sense that can philosophers ask questions that are relevant for science, for future inquiry? And that is what I've been trying to do, especially over the last year, in collaboration with other smell scientists. And that is basically what will be the book about, an accumulation of this kind of insight. What does it mean in practice? Well, what I'm interested in is to propose an alternative model of sensory processing that is based on smell, on the so-called idiosyncrasies on smell, which aren't so idiosyncratic at all. But that means to clarify a lot of things. First of all, what are the perceptual dimensions of odor? You ask 3 scientists, you get 5 answers if you're lucky. Because the answers range, and I kid you not, from 1 dimension to 32 to 400 up to 1 trillion. And I'm not kidding you about the 1 trillion. So it's clear that there are kind of different understandings of what perception is, what perceptual dimensions is, how to measure it. I mean, and this is what philosophers are good at, to figure out, to disentangle these different conceptualizations and how they're grounded in different observations. That also means to look at all the different kinds of evidence, and olfaction is inherently multidisciplinary. We've got neuroscience, we've got chemistry, psychology, but also there are experts in the arts when we think about winemaking, perfumery, where people look precisely at different forms of manipulating materials and perception. Integrating that is actually not that easy because, well, one of the things which are very interesting are the different opinions on how to deal with dissent in science. And in this case, part of my book will also integrate the interviews I did with a scientist to show how a field develops, what the open questions are, throughout its own development, throughout the voices of its key actors. Lastly, that brings us back to the question to map or not to map. Because, well, can odors be mapped and what are the dimensions? These 2 questions are the ones that will be integrated in my book. To answer that, well, why is that mapping thing so weird in smell, or what is so important about it? Well, Stuart likes to say there is this common trope in olfaction, from molecules to perception, from chemistry to psychophysics, as if we can extract the perceptual quality from the molecule. Now you might wonder, something is missing here. I mean, this has been done for over the entire 20th century, partly of the 21st century as far as we got during that century. Something is missing, namely, what is the smell for? The organism. And I know the philosophers will flinch that I basically integrate the mind and the brain, but what this is going to show is that we really need to think about the connection between philosophical psychology and neuroscience if we want to understand smell. We cannot just link the molecule with the perception, because there are a couple of interesting idiosyncrasies. To maybe give you an insight about how smell works and why it's so difficult to study it or to connect the molecule with the percept, the sense of smell was usually considered to be a very straightforward model system. Ramon y Cajal was the one who said, well, it basically is 1 to 2 synapses straight into the cortex. So what you're having is you have odorants, smelly, airborne molecules interacting with the receptors in your nose. What is interesting here is that the signal then gets further transmitted to the olfactory bulb at the frontal lobe of your brain. Now, what is really, really key here is that you have different receptors detecting basically different odorants. You've got a combinatoric explosion in your nose. One receptor is able to detect different odorants, and one odorant can be detected by different receptors. So this is why you can detect so many different structures, so many different smells, but there's no clear organization in the epithelium. So how does your brain deal with it? Well, actually by a very neat engineering trick. Each sensory neuron in your nose expresses only one receptor gene, and all neurons expressing that one receptor gene basically conjugate in one of those spherical blobs over there, the glomeruli. What is interesting then is that you have a fingerprint for each molecule, so to speak. You can look at activation patterns. You've got your map, or so it seems. And it was assumed that, well, this pattern, this neat pattern, you've got really a pattern for each odorant, should be further transferred to the cortex. Well, this is where trouble really started, because it doesn't. What instead happened is that the neurons fan out. They don't accumulate at neat, nice spatial areas as it would be with the other systems. So you've got basically a signal being, and this is just basically the projections from one glomerulus. This is a mouse brain. You have, what, 1,000 of that stuff. So you've got suddenly this mosaic explosion of signals. Where's the pattern of odors here? What are we actually mapping? There's no clear, straightforward organization. To put it as a metaphor, as if you're stepping from a neat and nice English garden where you can tell which rose stand next to the, I don't know, another flower. Can't come up with one right now. You get into the savannah where you don't even know what the next plant will be. So how to solve that? Well, what turned out is that this is a problem which was used to based on the stimulus. Like we're looking first of how the stimulus interacts with at the epithelium, then it gets nicely collected in the bulb, and then suddenly the signal spreads out. But we're not quite sure what we're modeling here, in a certain sense, because we still try to trace the stimulus input. We're still trying to find a representation of specific features, as if we're still trying to find the percept linked to the external stimulus. Maybe we should rethink that, because we should look more at the processes that make sense of chemical information. And in this context, one of the most key things I've been stressing is that we really should be careful not to say the percept is somehow encoded or the quality is encoded in the stimulus. Because the perceptual quality, the semantic object we're attributing to a smell, let's say apple or garlic or pea, is not the same as the cause of the material object. And there are two arguments to be made for that. First of all, completely different stimuli can lead to the same percept. And second of all, the same stimulus can lead to different percepts. The first case is the case of olfactory white, where you can have completely unrelated stimuli leading to the same olfactory quality. Olfactory white is a discovery by a neuroscientist at the Weizmann Institute, Noam Sobel, who showed that you can lump in any 30 molecules, note any 30 molecules, as long as their features are non-overlapping, and you get olfactory white, which is a quality nobody has encountered in the world before. It's not associated with any ordinary object, so to speak. And he even made the test of just having a really complex mixture of 60 plus molecule, arbitrarily divided them into two. Again, both had the same quality, completely unrelated. So it's a computation of your brain. Another case for that is many of your olfactory percepts are ambiguous. What if I give you two vials and one is called Parmesan and the other is called vomit? Well, apart from liking one more than the other, there was a study by Rachel Hertz, a psychologist, who showed that people were first adamant that these mixtures were not identical, they were different. And then, of course, assigned them different hedonic qualities. No, they were the same mixture. They both were butyric acid. And that's not surprising, because both in vomit, as well as in Parmesan, actually also in female ginkgo tree seeds, you've got butyric acid. And they smell sort of vomity, but in different contexts, they do give you a different semantic object. So this is the most important thing about smell, what I've been stressing. How can we correlate these different cognitive processes with a neural basis? We need to look at the process. That's the objective part of smell. It's not the link between some other structure and the percept, but rather the processes that connect it. Now you might wonder, well, first of all, is that really new? Second, what do the scientists actually say to that if you talk to them? Well, I had a chance to find out, and it was mortifying. I was very lucky to go to the 40th meeting of the Association of Chemoreception Sciences. And The field is fantastic because, as I mentioned, it was multidisciplinary, and Paul Breslin, who's the director of the Monell Center, he nicely said, well, you know, the field has no discipline. We are united by a question. How does it work? So there is space for a philosopher because we don't know how it works. And I was lucky to talk to a lot of the scientists and to give you just an overview about the different kinds of discipline being accumulated there. You have computational biology, flavor chemistry and psychology, hardcore analytic chemistry and psychology, clinical research and neuroscience. And it's quite often clear that they don't model the system in the same way. They don't understand even the problem in the same way or the answers. Some people are still adamant that there might be an algorithm connecting the structure to the odor. Other people are saying, well, maybe we should look at the different subsystems more. And I was supposed to give a talk by the end of it, after all these interviews. And I was mortified for a simple reason. What do you tell the scientist as a philosopher? I can't tell them about the brain, they know about that. I can't tell them about the chemistry, they kind of know about that. So what do I actually talk about without boring them? Well, I thought I'm answering or addressing the question, which was one of the first one being asked during that meeting by Leslie Kay, namely, well, smell is constantly influenced by so many factors. And if everything is contextual, well, what remains constant? Well, that's a very philosophical question, one that really, really requires us to think of it, because why smell in particular has been neglected from the science and the humanities was because it had the stain of subjectivity. Smells are this weird emotional feel, sort of different between observers. Is that really true? So I looked, on the one hand, why that idea of subjectivity was so strong for several centuries, to look kind of like a psychologist of the field into the development. How was the idea of subjectivity tied to the practices or lack of possibilities to investigate smell? The material basis, the conceptualization of the material basis. That led me to philosophical questions, namely, well, we should look at the conditions of our current knowledge. Is that really still justified by integrating the different research strands? And that led me to ask questions more in cognitive science. What kind of processes define smell? And how can we link it to this very dispersed mosaic of neural networks? And also, what kind of possible tests could we do? Now, I might have left you with more questions than actual answers, and that's actually intentional because I am a philosopher after all. But part of the question of, like, can you test this, is what I want to do in the next couple of years, where I've been lucky to work with more scientists. I'm going to be at the Cognitive Science Department in Bloomington, but also interact with the History and Philosophy of Science Department there, so I can do what I'm already doing, just with more stuff. And I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I would like to also reflect on something else, namely the nature of interdisciplinarity. I would like to close with the struggles I had, because we talked about interdisciplinarity a lot, and there are lots of funding calls having somehow the buzzword of interdisciplinarity. And it was Stuart who actually challenged me. He said, well, is interdisciplinarity really intrinsically valuable? Everybody says so. But can we have more than just somebody who's fluid in one and the other discipline, jumping back and forth? But can we have more than sort of mid-range expertise, something of like mediocre expertise? Is interdisciplinarity more than just being fluid in two disciplines? And I think it is, but it's not straightforward. The first thing is interdisciplinary work can be of a critical value, that it can explicate the assumptions of one discipline and make them more transparent through the lens of another. But also there's a certain form of exchange of ideas. You can make it in a heuristic way. Then there's the question of perspective. You can integrate, you can synthesize knowledge, and that is more than just an accumulation of knowledge. And this is why I put Dobzhansky on there. Because Dobzhansky, in his book, which was founding in the field, he integrated natural history and genetics, because these two were at war with each other at the beginning of the 20th century. Now we know that geneticists have won, but he made natural history valuable in that development, so they didn't completely die out. And if you look at the book, there's actually no new empirical insight in it. But through the synthesis, he created a new outlook for the discipline, and that is what interdisciplinary work can do. Lastly, there is development, in the sense of we can really actively develop things together, but this is where collaboration is most fundamental for interdisciplinary work. Otherwise, without collaboration, interdisciplinarity is bound to fail. And lastly, that also should make us reflect on our own disciplines, because we are disciplinarily trained. And perhaps the greatest surprise of my own research is, in the last 3 years, is that I am in fact a philosopher. Which is something I really had to think about over the last 2 years, especially with the job market, where it's like, is that still philosophy? Well, I had to answer this question. I said yes, and I had to really think about that, because it shows us that we have to rethink our own discipline. We have to rethink about what we can do with our discipline, and what are the kind of shifting boundaries of it. Philosophy is as transient as is the science, and we should acknowledge that. And with that, I would like to thank all the people who made this possible, because I talked about collaboration. And you see, some of the people who lend me their time and talk endlessly about smell with me, I would love to thank my lab, who has been actually patient enough to answer all the questions I had for them. Stuart, of course, my mentor Chris as well, and Pamela for somehow having, in a rush of a moment, hiring me, the idea of that. Melinda and Joseph, all the other fellows who have so many different topics and have always come up with good questions when I nag them. And if you're interested in my work, this is the stuff I published so far doing these 3 years. Feel free to ask me questions, and thank you very much for the patience.
Thank you.